old is the Bible? That is the question I was investigating when I first heard about the Muratorian Fragment. The Muratorian Fragment is one of the key texts for establishing the 2nd century origin of the canon of the Christian New Testament. It is preserved as pages 10 and 11 in an 8th century book or codex known as the Muratorian Codex. The fragment enumerates most of the 27 books of the traditional New Testament canon. Having spent 10 years writing a monograph on this topic, by summer 2019, I was ready to see the manuscript in person. It is carefully guarded here at the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan, Italy. So I wrote to the chief librarian, Monsignor Dr. Federico Gallo, requesting to see it. And in less than 24 hours, I was flatly denied. Recognizing that I couldn't write my book without seeing the artifact in person, I consulted Michael I. Allen. He's an expert in medieval manuscripts at the University of Chicago. Michael Allen told me that I could write one more time to the library. But I had to be extremely deferential. And Michael Allen told me that I should say that I'm interested in medieval marginalia. Medieval marginalia are drawings or doodles in the margins of ancient manuscripts. Sometimes they're rather ornate. You see here 2 rabbits jousting. So I wrote to Don Gallo, and I said I was very deferential, and I told him that I was interested in medieval marginalia. And then I characterized my life and work as soli Deo gloria, for the glory of God alone. And within a week, I received an invitation to the library. Don Gallo said that I could visit his library on Monday, October 14th at 9 a.m. for 1 hour, and I could examine the Muratorian Codex under the auspice of his priests. So I wrote to Michael Allen, and I told him that I had an invitation from the library, and he gave me 3 pieces of advice. Number 1, he said, bring white gloves, because they might be required for touching the precious manuscript. Number 2, bring an expensive bottle of wine as a gift for Don Gallo. And number 3, if at all possible, purchase the digital images in advance and all but memorize them. On Saturday, I arrived in Milan, and after I checked into my hotel, I walked over to the library, mostly to see how long it took to get there. When I arrived, the art gallery associated with the library was open, and so I paid to enter and lightly perused the collection. As I was traversing the hallways of this former monastery, I bumped into this, an imposing bust of Signor Antonio Maria Ceriani, the 18th century librarian of the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, who had permitted 2 very distinguished New Testament scholars to examine the Muratorian Codex. They were B.F. Westcott and Samuel Prideaux Tregelles. On Sunday, I went to the landmark grocer in the city center of Milan. It's called Peck. They sell fine wines, fine cheeses, and produce. And I purchased a bottle of wine. There it is. I paid 175 euros. You see, they put it in a shiny black bag with a gold tassel. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was rehearsing over and over in my head. What would I do when I got to the library? Who would I ask to see? What would I do if I was permitted to enter the legendary reading room? And what would I do if I was permitted to examine the Muratorian Codex? On Monday morning, I woke up, grabbed the white gloves, the bottle of wine, and my computer, put everything in a backpack, and I walked over to the library. When I arrived, I pried open the huge wooden doors, and I entered the lobby. I approached the guard, and I asked to see Signor Stefano Serventi. The guard gestured at this huge stone chair built into the wall, so I took a seat. Within a few minutes, a short man with dark hair and a beard approached me. He introduced himself as Serventi. I gave him the bottle of wine for Don Gallo, and he said the words I was hoping to hear. You will be permitted to enter our library today. So I went over to the guard, and I filled out all the paperwork, and I turned over my passport, and he buzzed me through the glass door. I put all of my things in a locker, And then I approached the reading room and I opened the door and I entered the legendary reading room. Quietly, I crossed the floor to the librarian. And I asked to see the Muratorian Codex, but I used the shelf mark. So I said, I would like to see Ambrosian I-101 Superior. And he said, in Italiano. So I said, Ambrosiano I-101 Superiori, hoping that that was close. And he disappeared into the stacks behind him. When he returned, he was carrying an ancient codex. He pointed at the first bank of desks, so I took a seat. He placed the codex on 2 gray foam book props in front of me and dropped a few tiny black bean bags next to it. I gestured at my white gloves. He shook his head, no. Now I turned to face the manuscript in front of me. I immediately noticed these tiny late antique crosses embossed in the leather cover, which were there on the digital images. So I opened the cover. And then I saw 2 tables of contents, both incorrect, one of them lined out, a feature I had expected to see. And so I turned the page again to the first yellowed, rippled page of ancient parchment, where I read, Liber Sancti Columbani de Bobbio, Ioannis Chrysostomi. The book belonging to Saint Columbanus of Bobbio, containing the works of John Chrysostom. 10 years of work, and there it was, the Muratorian Codex, a book that few scholars had been permitted to examine since the Middle Ages. So I went to work. I made notes. Here you see my binder full of the color copies from the digital images. So I made notes in my binder on the individual pages. First, I turned to the Muratorian Fragment on pages 10 and 11, and I did a careful examination a few times of those pages. I looked at every letter, every line, every aspect of the margin a few times. And when I was done, I started at the beginning of the Codex. I made the same examination of all of the pages, 75 folios, 150 pages. And when I finished, I came up for air. I looked at the clock. 2 hours had passed. I looked at the librarian. He was immersed in something in his computer. So I thought, I'll keep working. I'll work until he asks me to leave. So I began at the beginning of the Codex again, and this time I relaxed a little. And I began to check all of my notes and make the examination again, looking for liquid damage, insect damage, notes in the margin. And I also noticed that if I slouched down a little bit and tilted the manuscript, viewing it from a different perspective, things were visible that I hadn't noticed the first time around when I was sitting upright. So I made this examination of all the pages, and when I got to page 42, I turned over to page 43. And I examined page 43, and then I tilted the manuscript slightly, very gently. I spotted something on the bottom margin. It was like I was in a dream. 2 tiny heads emerged. And I knew right away who they were, because this part of the Codex contains a letter from John Chrysostom to his friend Theodore of Mopsuestia, fellow theologian. John and Theodore pledged to one another that they would remain celibate for life, but Theodore met a woman named Hermione. He fell in love and he went back on his pledge, so John wrote him a letter contained in this codex, begging him to return to their commitment. So it seems that some monk between the 9th and the 11th centuries had taken his pen, but without any ink, and etched in the bottom margin tiny images of Hermione and Theodore. So what was I supposed to do? I thought of calling the librarian over, and then I decided against it. I realized I couldn't use my phone and take a picture, and I didn't think anyway that the image would show up on a picture that I took on my phone. So I realized that my only choice was to sketch it. Not being an artist, this is what I drew. And I also made a few notes about who I thought they were. And then I went back through the entire manuscript again, looking for doodles and drawings in the margins. I found a few things, but nothing as significant as this drawing. And after a few more hours, I decided I was finished. So I picked up the manuscript. I returned it to the librarian. I thanked him in Italian. I got my things out of the locker, and I left the library. And as I was walking down the street, admittedly in a bit of a daze, I heard a voice, "Professoressa! Professoressa!" I turned around. It was Don Gallo, and he was running after me. So I stopped. "Professoressa," he said, "was everything in order in your time in my library?" And I smiled and said it had been, and I thanked him. And he thanked me for the bottle of wine. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, I blurted out, "There's a cartoon on the bottom of 43V." And he looked at me. And then he smiled. "A discovery," he said. And he turned and went back to the library. And I immediately turned into this cafe because I wanted to open my computer and go to the digital image of page 43, scroll down to the bottom and expand the size and see if I could see the drawing on the digital image. And I could. On the left there, you see Hermione facing stoically forward with a veil over her head. And on the right, poor Theodore, pining eyes, leaning in toward her, with locks over his forehead and a handsome short beard. This artistic representation was drawn by a friend of mine, Gail Schoonmaker. In my decade-long commitment to understanding the oldest New Testament canon list, I discovered a 1,000-year-old drawing, possibly by a 10th century monk taunting his fellow monks. Was this a colossal waste of time, or the greatest thing that ever happened to me? There is a Latin phrase that I think sums it up. Fortuna eruditis fauit. Luck favors the prepared. But is that it? I mean, I saw the lover's doodle when I directed my attention away from what I actually came to see. So I conclude, look away now and then. Slouch down a little. Direct your eyes to the margins. Tilt your perspective, because you never know what you'll discover. Thank you.